I'm very happy to be joined today by Henrik Andersen, the CEO of Vestas, the global leader in sustainable energy solutions. Vestas is a Danish company, over 125 years old, has been manufacturing and selling turbines for over 40 years, about 35 of these years really specialized in wind turbines. Largest manufacturer in the world by capacity, operating in 30 countries with close to 30,000 employees and with revenues of around 15 billion euro a year. Before he became the CEO of Vestas, Henrik was the CEO of Hempel, a global supplier of coatings and paints. Henrik, thank you very much for joining us today. Let me start by asking you a comparison today of the cost of wind energy versus hydrocarbon or coal. Historically, of course, wind energy was more expensive. Today, I think the comparison is much more favorable. Give us an idea where we are.
I think the real change has happened within the last decade. When we exited the financial crisis in 9 and 10, reality was we needed government subsidies in somewhere around 99% of the world markets from governments. Today, coming into the 20s, it's the complete opposite. We need subsidies in less than 1% of the world markets to be competitive. When we then sort of look at what's the cost of energy in comparison, which is often mentioned as the levelized cost of energy, onshore wind sits somewhere around 40 to 45 euro per megawatt hour. If we compare that to the coal, which is typically half of that for established coal, and if you compare it to fossil, it's typically a third of what goes on in the fossil world. And of course, then when you look at the new nuclear established larger plants around the world, it's off the scale. So it typically works around a tenth of that, which is the starting price for new nuclear electricity.
So onshore wind is actually a lot cheaper than any of these other solutions.
It is.
Okay. Now, of course, one of the challenges is onshore wind is dependent on the wind blowing, I guess. But when it's blowing, the point is it is now cheaper. Again, please forgive me for a naive question. How predictable is wind? And just like the sun doesn't always shine, when we have turbines, do they produce like 100% of the time, 80% of the time? Is there like an average turbine works, 60% of the time on average or 80% of the time?
You will work typically towards the 40-50% capacity usage, depending a bit on where you are in the world and what site suitability you have.
And how about offshore?
Yeah, you can say the offshore, you can always question, will offshore ever reach the complete same level in the levelized cost of energy? Because imagine you are sailing something out, you are digging typically into the seabed, you are drawing cables back to shore. So therefore, when we look at the comparison today, you have offshore sitting somewhere at a price tag which is somewhere around 50% more expensive than the onshore. But of course, where you can find close near shore, not deep water near shore, then of course offshore becomes relevant and also more cheap compared to that. But still offshore is more expensive than onshore.
So more expensive than onshore, but given the numbers you gave us a second ago, can still be less expensive than some of the fossil fuels.
Absolutely. There's no competition in that anymore.
How does the carbon footprint compare?
Interestingly, we have put up approximately 160 gigawatt over the last 4 decades. That means our turbines replaces 220 million tons of CO2 every year. That's equal to what 130 million passenger cars on the road emits in CO2. And if you want to have it translated into a proper tangible turbine, we use CO2 through the steel and through the manufacturing to produce the blades and the nacelle. But that means in the life cycle of a turbine, after approximately months 4 to 5, the turbine goes CO2 neutral, and then in reality becomes CO2 negative for its remaining life up till plus 30 years.
Wow. Okay. So a very quick return on investment from a carbon perspective.
Yes, yes.
Now, the value chain. You make wind turbines. What do you buy from whom, and to whom do you sell what? Because there are some names that we know of. We all know of Ørsted, for example. I think Ørsted is a client for you. So tell us how the value chain work.
Yeah, as you see the value chain, you have thousands of components that goes into it. So when you see a turbine and you pass a turbine, you will often see 3 blades, you will see a nacelle, you will see a hub, and you will see a tower. But of course, inside all of that, there is quite a lot of electronics. There are electronics components, of course, that also makes it possible to connect to the grid, and therefore the electricity comes back to the grid in a format we can use from the turbine. So for us, we source a lot from a global built supply chain across multiple countries. We have put turbines up in more than 85 countries, and we source from similar back to in-country factories in just less than 20 countries.
So you design them, and then you manufacture them, and you install them.
Exactly.
And then you service them also.
And then when, as I said, for a customer like Ørsted or a customer like most of the global utilities or infrastructure funds, then of course the real interesting part of the journey starts when we have commissioned it, because that's the first time in the whole build process where they start having a revenue. And that's the day one in our service maintenance partnership with the customer, which then makes the turbine last as much as 35 years.
Let's dive into the company as such. So, revenue-wise, Vestas has been doing very well. You've enjoyed very good growth, and as you mentioned, you're number 1 in the world. Fair?
Yeah.
Now, the challenge is that the gross margins, and even worse, the EBITDA margins, have been low for years. And in fact, in 2022, were so low that you ended up losing significant amounts of money. Now, I read a quote from you in the Financial Times where you said, look, it's a little bit of madness to see that the solutions we provide for customers have never been so valuable, but we're losing money. And in fact, for a while, some of your customers were making a lot of money. So basically, what's happening? You're making a great product, your clients love it, they make money with it often, but somehow we're not able to capture enough of it at the Vestas level.
Yeah. No, I think we need, and therefore I always go back, and I think there's something we probably have spent most time in also, first of all, mitigating, but also getting into and understanding what is it and where is it that there is a disconnect in a supply chain like ours, because the resilience we had in a global supply chain is fairly robust. But of course, when you suddenly start seeing that the COVID gave an enormous backlog on inbound, especially on containers, which means we start lack of components, but we have an obligation to also deliver our turbines, because as you said, we all see it's critical infrastructure, because it did make electricity in all markets, also under COVID, where we needed the electricity. So having to deliver on that in years where components are suddenly becoming in shortage and we are restricted on getting our components in time, that gave a very unpredicted inflation into our long order backlog.
Okay.
And of course, if we see how a structure work in a project for wind turbines, typically it goes over 5 years. You work on a permitting. When you get to a permitting stage, then you also get a permitting, you get a financial closure, and you get a price on the turbines. Okay. And then really starts another 2 years where we ramp up to deliver of the turbines before the electricity
Takes about 2 years to make the thing.
Yeah, and if you go into see, as we announce every quarter, we announce our backlog of turbines. So I always got used to that. Having a big backlog is a fantastic positive, which it is for most companies. But of course, for us, the backlog suddenly was that we couldn't hedge all of the variables in the backlog due to the supply chain shortages and scarcity. And there we were hit much harder than probably most industries, which is coming back to my comment of, it is a pretty tough one to sit with, that we are losing EBIT, weighted EBIT on the individual turbine, while the output from the turbine in electricity price, in Europe at least, was in many cases 15, 20 times more valuable than it has been in the last 10 years. Can we ever overcome that? Not completely. But one of the things we've also seen is that in the binding period where we say to the customer, you have a binding offer from Vestas, that has been shortened from probably in previous COVID days, 6 to 9 months, now down to something which is a month to 45 days, where you have to clear your variables as a customer. So we have of course stepped back and saying we can't live with that situation. We can't live with that our turbine as the asset is the one that bears the negative consequences of the market volatility.
So what you're saying is, look, we sign contracts after 2 years of permitting and discussions, and these contracts essentially are signed 2 years before we deliver the turbine.
Yes.
And if I understand, you're saying these contracts typically don't forecast any form of significant inflation of any kind. And over the last 2-3 years, because of COVID, and because of other factors, we've sustained significantly greater inflation, including because we were scrambling around to get the components. That would mean that the low EBITDA is temporary. It's related to the situation and the backlog. Does that mean that 2023 is going to be good and 2024 great?
I'm always nervous about good and great. But as I
fair.
said, in financial terms, we are aiming for coming out of something that was close to 8% negative EBIT last year. We are aiming at something that is around the zero this year. We'll fight really hard to get to a small black number. And then next year is also on our way to 2025 with a 10% EBIT. So that actually sets a little bit how volatile it has been. Can you take some fixed points in that? You have seen our pricing in general increasing somewhere in excess of 30% on the average selling price over the last 10 to 12 quarters, which is a good indication, average, of where the market has actually been, which also is a positive for us because it also means that it is temporary, but also reflecting back and saying, you sort of said, well, it was inflationary measure. Yeah, come on, stop a second. A container price to get across the world went from somewhere around $4,000 to in some cases $30,000. And then for us, even worse, you might not get it on time. So one thing was that you potentially could pay the enormous price uplift, but the other thing was you were not even sure you could still get it.
Understood. Now, 2-3 follow-up questions on this, if I may. How much differentiation is there between you and your competitors? Can we say that the Vestas turbines are better than theirs?
There is a difference. And there is a difference in, first of all, how we test. There is a difference in how we also provide life cycle guarantees on the turbine. So therefore, there is a difference. And we can see that. And therefore, both from a technology point of view and a quality point of view, we absolutely put an effort into that.
The reason I'm asking, Henrik, is because there are some products that are hard to differentiate, right? And so basically it becomes more of a low cost sort of strategy, where if we can show that our product is better, obviously we get some pricing power. That's what I was after.
Yeah, no, and I think here you can also see part of it when we start talking about that 10, 12 quarters ago. If we didn't have any pricing power, I don't think we would have been necessarily in a position where we could have increased prices to the point of what we have done. And I also know that here for us, it's very much a testament that it's not just a turbine, it's also making the solution come online. Because you as a customer, you really want to say to the government or the country you're building in, at that date you can count on that there's more energy flowing. So that is where the turbine is the piece of hardware, but has all the soft and also technology that has to be connected and provides you. Otherwise, it's just a turbine standing there for fun.
And the reliability, I guess, of you as a project manager.
Yeah, that's again a question of do you have any lost production time? And that also means that the capacity and the availability of not only the turbine but the wind park is there.
Now, another factor that I read about as a contributor to cost potentially, I guess also as a contributor to a reduction in the cost of production, but of electricity, but then as an increase in the cost of production of the turbines, is this sort of technological race toward bigger and bigger turbines. How costly is this for you to have this race to bigger and bigger turbines?
I think it's always a balance, because if you are in an industry where technology development actually adds to the efficiency of the solution, you will always have a very important driver of your technology in there.
Okay.
On the other hand, it also has to balance off if you don't have the technology long enough that you get the manufacturing scalability in and therefore the cost out structure. I think that balance the industry probably has to some extent struggled a little bit by finding. And I think this is back to the point of, is the industry mature or versus immature? I will say in the onshore, fairly mature. In the offshore, maturing, but still not mature. And that's where there has been an unbalance of people have come out, said there's a new turbine, this is what they call an arms race. And there we are just saying, come on guys, now we got turbines and we got technology out there that are strong enough from one turbine to provide electricity to 20,000 households in one turbine. At least that will last probably throughout this decade. And that will also give us an opportunity to both localize and scale the technology. So it's finding that balance. As you would appreciate, as a leading voice in the industry, I think we need to talk to that, because if we don't talk to it, then it just continues being a bit silly money thrown into the technology.
So you expect that there will be a slowdown in this arms race over the next few years?
Yeah, also because we can see, for instance, in the US right now, where the IRA has come as a government initiative over 10 years, a lot of that links into that it also provides electricity into hydrogen and therefore into the electrolyzers. And there you have to catch the whole range of wind rather than just high or medium wind. So it designs also the turbine for what you want to have out as an output.
Now, we've seen significant capacity growth and revenue growth, as we've discussed, but in fact, you've been arguing that we could have had even more growth, but part of the problem is that governments are apparently struggling to accelerate the awarding of permits. One statistic that I read leading up to this discussion is that the capacity stuck at various stages of the approval process is about 4 times the volume under development. So if we're developing 100 right now, there's another 400 that's kind of stuck somewhere along the approval process. Why is it taking so long?
Now, I think let's 2 things. First of all, we got a political system that basically have delegated a lot of the permitting process to our local communities. And when you delegate authority on that level, of course, you also delegate and build bureaucracy around it.
Okay.
So that's one observation. So when you now suddenly sit, especially in Europe, in an energy crisis caused by what happened in Ukraine and with Russia, then of course you struggle to take it back and saying now we centralizing the decision and permitting, which actually is discussed in Europe right now. Is there a way where we can say there is a maximum time limit on getting the permitting done? That has another upside if doing that, because today if you're 5 or 6 years under the permitting, 5 or 6 years ago what you permitted 5 or 6 years is equal to, I don't know, but I'm pretty sure you don't have an iPhone 6 or iPhone 5. That also means you're permitting older technology less efficient.
Right.
And therefore really having a much shorter permitting process both drives better technology, more powerful technology, and also a smoother build out. And the truth of it is for Europe last year had a target of 30 gigawatt for reaching towards net zero, and reduced CO2 or carbon emission targets in 2030, and we only did 15. So we only did half of the target we had in Europe for the build out, and we have 80 gigawatt, which is actually close to a factor 5.5 in the permitting backlog, which is not right.
You just told me a bit earlier the electricity we produce is cheaper than fossil fuel. Not only is it cheaper, it's also enormously cleaner. And it seems to me that if I'm the government, I really want you to do more of this. And then it turns out that somehow I'm not giving you as many opportunities to grow this clean and cost-efficient energy source. I mean, I understand bureaucracy, but is it really bureaucracy, or is it the not in my backyard syndrome? Is that one of the issues you face?
I think it has been over the last decade, but actually what you have seen in the last 2 to 3 years, that is also changing. So the population are saying we would actually like more of it, and we would like to have it fast, because of course we can see that also brings our utility bills down. And if we look at the consumers right now, we all vote in that behavior. We take electric cars, or we take heating pumps back home. So we're all electrifying. So somehow here we also want to have that more stable supply coming in. So I think what we today is caught a little bit in, that the permitting authority is not having an incentive to do it. So if we look at it, most countries will have their energy supply sorted from a government central point of view. But if you are a municipality, you are mayor in a municipality, you have to be re-elected, and you do a permitting, but you don't get an incentive of the energy generation. So one of our strong drivers and one of our strong proposals is give the municipalities and give the permitting authority local an opportunity to benefit of all for the permitting, because that will actually create a much stronger drive and a much stronger connection between central and local government.
Will it also help the local mayor to convince the citizens to accept?
I think so, because of course if you're living in a local society, you also would like to know that that benefit stays in the local society.
So, but here maybe one of the issues is also that we're asking communities to accept these wind farms, which, let's be frank, are I mean, of course for you maybe this is incredibly aesthetic, but for most communities this is a bit of a hindrance. And the question is, what are they getting out of it? So you're saying maybe we need to share a little bit better the revenue produced by these solutions.
Especially now, where you can sort of say, if we don't do anything in Europe, we are probably bound by a system where the retail and the consumer price for us is 5-6 times higher than the cost price of putting new capacity up. And I think there it is a little bit, what do we see when we see a wind turbine? Do we see a energy power plant, or do we actually see something, I don't want that near me? And a lot of our farming and agriculture has changed structure over the last 20 years. So this about that it stands next to my house or something like that, that is actually not right anymore. So we can do a lot of build out, plus we can do repowering of where the existings are. So if you have 10 existing turbines, 15 years old, we can replace the 10 with 3 new, and then you will have the same output.
Are some governments doing a better job than others?
Yes. And
can we mention some of them, or not to shame anybody?
I know, but I think we can mention a few. We got a number of the Nordic governments in Finland and Sweden that have been really active in permitting and doing that, because they could see that moves industries, that moves companies from an energy independence and an energy safety point. Then they move either their data centers or they move their production closer to where the energy generation is. I will also say France, for once, surprised me in a sense of that they got a end of 22 a auction wrong. They readdressed that, and in May 23 they reassessed the terms for the auction and got a full subscribed auction. Then we also have a number of countries where you can say, where they are a bit more opportunistic in the auction setting. And that's where the private sector now is saying, well, then you will have unsubscribed auctions, which is absolutely not benefiting neither the country or neither the local supply chain.
Now, you're a global firm with presence in over 80 countries, and of course, there are currently geopolitical challenges and discussions. So, the US introduced the Inflation Reduction Act. The EU is seeking to make the North Sea a powerhouse. How do you think of geographical targets for you? Are you really focused on Europe? Are you also interested in the US? Are you interested in Asia?
No, I will say here, for us, we are two global company. We have been in most of the global markets as Asia Pacific. We were some of the first ones that established it in the likes of Australia, in the likes of also part of Vietnam when they started build out. So we are a true global company. We have had factories in the US for more than 20 years.
Okay.
And in the US, interesting enough, where Europe, we always say IRA is a new thing. It takes the whole renewable industry away from Europe and into the US. The truth of it is, US have built renewable capacity in solar and wind for 30 years. The PTC, that was the extension and the foundation for IRA, was introduced in 1992. So for us, I travel. If I wasn't founded and headquartered in Denmark, I would probably be living in the US, because Vestas' main material market is still the US, and then we see Europe, and then we see Asia Pacific, especially with Australia, that could become one of those. Then we have the south of the Americas in LATAM, and I think LATAM is not to be underestimated here, because in many ways the conditions for doing the hydrogen, and therefore also the power to X, in the sense of both in the agriculture world, the fertilizers and other stuff, is absolutely probably most optimal in Latin America. So we will see new continents becoming stronger and stronger in this part.
I guess in the US it's mainly onshore?
It's mainly onshore up until now. They started and embarked on the offshore, but I think the offshore in the US will have a little bit of a stop and a go until we get the supply chain and we also get the energy positioned, because the onshore is so strong and it has so positive and attractive conditions that offshore will struggle to compete directly compared.
There are places in the world that are deserts or quasi-deserts where it so happens that there's a fair amount of wind. Now, it also happens that there's a fair amount of sand that's being moved around. Is this a potential place for you to have like gigantic wind farms, or do you need a sufficiently clean environment because otherwise the turbines get clogged or something?
No, the turbine works well. We have large wind parks also in Saudi Arabia already established. So you will find, and this is where the whole power to X and therefore the e-methanol, the green fuel production will actually open new markets. Because if some of those markets are better positioned for refueling, for instance, the ship and the transport sector, then it's easier to see suddenly an Oman, part of Egypt, where you go through the Suez Canal and others. That's where it then becomes natural to refuel on its way on the normal natural transportation routes. So you will see new areas coming live in probably the next decade that we didn't pretend was there 5 years ago.
We live in an era where there are growing concerns that the climate change may in fact be happening even faster than we were afraid it was going to. And of course this is raising significant concerns over the future. How optimistic are you that the world is going to be able to accelerate the energy transition and other forms of carbon reduction in a way that will reduce the increased temperature? I think by now pretty much everybody understands that 1.5 degree is not going to happen, but how confident are you in the future?
I'm positive Because if I was standing here together with you and we talked about 1.5 degrees and I share your concern, I think we are beyond that point, and we didn't have the tools, then I'll be nervous, because then you can't talk to the solution.
Right.
And if you can't talk people in the direction of the solution, it becomes sort of a bit more theoretical, and then it becomes suddenly an over-normal investment for society to save. But I take today a lot of credit and optimism in, and I think I was reminded in London only a couple of weeks ago, where I listened to Ed Miliband, and he said something which this is how it came out, and he said, it's actually to a point now where the world, it is cheaper to save the planet than it is to destroy it.
Yeah.
And that's a fantastic catchline, and I personalized it immediately and thought that's a good one, because that is actually in one sentence bottling the optimism, because there is nothing else to explain to everyone. It is cheaper to save it now, and we have the time to save it. But I have two daughters, 21 and 24. That concerns me, because they will be the generation that experience now permanent climate change, which not necessarily are able to reverse back to what it was.
On the positive side, it sounds that increasingly the onus is on us. I mean, this is no longer a technology issue.
No. And the good thing is, if you look around in some of the real energy majors, and we have a number of them in Europe, like the Shell and the Total and the Equinor and the BPs of the world, they're getting it. So,
but let's be frank, they're getting it, but they're still investing less in that area. At least they seem to be investing less in that area, that they're still investing, for some of them, in finding new oil.
Sure, because the energy price on the existing resources and the new oil is actually treated slightly different to where governments are setting the price for electricity from the renewable. And if that world just narrows a little bit in the price band, I can promise you they will be throwing as much against the renewable as they will do on the existing.
And so again, that takes us back to the importance of the governments getting the regulatory framework right.
And the government here is often a 4-year re-elected political government versus a 30-year assets build out. And that's a little bit the equation we need to find a solution to.
Jean-Claude Juncker, a European politician years ago, said, the problem you see is not knowing what to do. Most of us know what to do. We just don't know how to get re-elected once we've done it. But that's clearly an issue that we're going to have to face.
It's better for us to stand here and have a life.
But we're still going to have to help them solve. On a more personal side, you became the CEO of Vestas in slightly unusual conditions, in the sense that you had been on the board for 6 years. How much of an advantage or a disadvantage is it to become the CEO of a company that you've been sitting on the board of for 6 years?
I would say it's an advantage. It's an advantage in the sense of that, first of all, you got somewhere in here, you have a company in your DNA, in your genes. You know it. You know, you're caught to both the feeling around the company, and you know something around the DNA and also the values in the company, which is a big advantage. I think you know what you're buying. You know what you're buying, okay. But on the other hand, I'm not that naive at the age of mine now that when you're in a board, there is just a lot you don't know. And let's just be frank, we shouldn't know in the board all of it around the
Of course.
So if you have that open mindset and open eyes when you start, I think it's fine.
Was there any form of discomfort from the management team or people lower in the organization that a board member would become CEO, or did people welcome the fact that, again, you already had experience with the company, you had shown your interest in the company? How was this welcomed?
No, I think I spent, and to some extent, timing is what timing is. I came in August 19. I always travel around when I get a new job like that. So I spent most of the time until Christmas in seeing the whole world.
Just in time for COVID.
Absolutely. We had the last trip in the US in end of February 2020. And in reality, after that, the world closed down, at least around us for a period of time. And that gave me enough opportunity, and it gave a lot of colleagues an opportunity to see a person like we're standing here, I love I love being at locations, whether that's a factory or it's the service depots or it's the office locations. So I managed to get around to quite a number of colleagues. So I hope at least that gave a good introduction of both who I am and also how the colleagues around in the world, what we could expect of Directional. And then we got a surprise thrown at us through the COVID.
Now, your new chairman, as of this spring, is the CEO you succeeded to. Now, he had stayed in the meantime as chairman of one of the units. Now, having the ex-CEO on the board usually has, and especially chairing the board, has some advantages and sometimes some disadvantages. How is that working?
No, I can absolutely find a cocktail where it will never work, and for us it works really well.
Okay.
For me, it was half a condition also, because I've seen a couple of times where succession, at CEO succession, has become a lot more about when you work in an industry like ours, where it's not a retail, it's not a day-to-day, it's a 3 to 5 year backlog. Right. It's long lead times, it's long lead time of technology. I've also seen under those circumstances that sometimes it's easier to blame the old CEO. For both Anders and I, we run relatively modest on personal egos. So for us, it's about Vestas. It's about doing the best for Vestas in the interest of 29,000 colleagues around in the world. So for us, it was from day one, how do we make this as a non-event for Vestas? And how do we actually make it open, that we both appreciate each other's company? So for the first 3 months, we actually traveled around to a number of customers.
That's when you succeeded him?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And customers found that pretty funny, because of course they could now sit and they could have 2 CEOs. They
for the
felt
price of one.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that gave us a very relaxed, because of course customers, colleagues could see that we were relaxed with it. And that we have kept all the way since. And Anders today appreciate that he doesn't have to travel 200 days a year.
Okay.
And he appreciate that he's chairman, and that's why he pays me a higher salary than the chairman.
Right.
And he laughs of that, and then we get on in life and we do that. But it's also like we are both available, we are both in the present representing Vestas, but he does have other opportunities to do things.
Well.
Yeah.
But I like very much the point that you made about the CEO succession. You're saying, look, the fact that we get along well today maybe also has something to do with the fact that when I succeeded him, it was just the time had come for him to step out, and you had a very orderly and friendly handover, yeah. I guess.
Yeah. And especially in an industry where technology has 3 to 6, 7 years lead time, you have really, what was your thinking when you had those discussions? We at a board was part of it. I sat on the board since 2013. So you have had pieces right. of the puzzle, but never the full puzzle. So for me to say, come on, let's join a coffee and just sit with a couple of colleagues here, super valuable.
You have access to the history Absolutely. And to the reasoning.
Absolutely.
Okay. Now, you were CEO of Hempel for a bit more than 3 years. You've now been the CEO of Vestas for almost 4. What in the CEO role stays the same, and what is different across context? If you compare your tenure as a CEO at Hempel and now at Vestas.
No, I think the one thing that stays the same is whatever people believes and say around a CEO role, it is the world's loneliest job in the company, because you only have a board above you. And that means anything from that angle is that you have to sometimes go away and have your own thoughts about what has to happen. On the other hand, you run a wide team in a company both like Vestas and also in Hempel. So I always enjoyed where you have a playground that is global, because that's where you see multi-cultures actually competing with your company culture.
Okay.
So we are in 24 time zones today. We are across 86 countries. So we have to unite 29,000 plus colleagues across religion, across time zones, across political regimes. And I think that's for me probably one of the best passionate challenges in having the CEO role on companies of that scale. That is really
creating a shared identity.
Yeah. Yes, and
a
as I
shared
said,
purpose.
Both companies, you know it from history. Both companies have used also some of the tools in the IMD suite, because the culture drivers and how you work with your leadership team. I'm not in for 2 years and out again. I like to see the long journeys, actually, where you can really affect your leadership culture, but not least also how the leadership culture connects with the company culture and the values.
Now, I imagine that in the case of the Vestas position, you're spending more time managing governmental and regulatory stakeholders. Is that a fair statement?
That's a fair statement.
And what percentage of your time do you spend
managing
stakeholders?
I think I have an incredible good team of public affairs, and
Okay.
I have a incredibly good team of how we have done an operating model. So we have 5 regional presidents and CEOs. They reality cover the world of geography. They report to me alongside the executive management board. So we call it the famous team of 13. And they take their fair bit of it, because if I was becoming the political head, then I wouldn't be the right person for it. So I'm still the person that is highly commercial, highly operational in running it. When we have done a strategic initiative, it's all about executing and following up. But looking back, one thing I appreciate sort of in the job I have today, I wouldn't have liked to have that job earlier in life.
Okay,
because I've
why
learned.
not?
No, but I would just sort of say this becomes the concentrate and the full suite. It's a 24/7, 365, and I know a lot of people will say that. But when you are a 100% free float company, you got government and political interest as well, and then you have your company activities as well. That's where I will just say you have every stakeholder possible, both in momentum together, but also sometimes in conflict. So I have to say I went through a good school, and I enjoyed every year I have spent in that school of leadership until I took the job in 19.
What's the most difficult aspect of the current job of you being the CEO of Vestas? Is it this relentlessness that you just evoked?
I think what I've found here is that we have it's a highly cyclical. We have always said it's cyclical, and the cyclicality sometimes surprises you when it happens. And in this case, how it was magnified more by, first of all, the COVID, the supply chain, and to some extent also the war zone in Ukraine afterwards, has surprised us. And therefore, that probably is the one thing I sort of have found a lot of thoughts and humbleness, and it drives. We are one of the world's largest project businesses. Right. So when you have something that is serial technology, serial manufacturing, we got service day in and day out, but still the main solution we install for customers is a project business. And that triggers a little bit back to what everyone says. We also used IMD in that sense. How do you get the predictability in executing projects on the scale we do in probably more than 30 countries at any given one single time?
Now, we've just alluded to the challenge of the relentlessness and the complexity of the job. So I imagine that in this context, you said, it's basically 24/7, 365 days a year. What are some of your practices to keep yourself at peak performance through this relatively grueling regimen?
First of all, I think this where people say, well, can you balance everything, and is there a work-life balance? I don't think as a CEO there is a work-life balance. I have to say, and for a CEO taking a job like this, it's for a limited time period, and you have to give it your best shot. What I try to do also is on an executive level, it melts a little bit together. I wouldn't like anyone to work for me if they didn't know who the private person was as well. So some of us, we get together a number of times during the year to see families and relatives. So at least back home, you don't have this, oh, you work with Henrik, I maybe seen him in the paper or something. No, actually here we see each other and
so more integration.
More integration
of the personal life and the work life.
And a little bit also sometimes show when you are not at your best, show when you are at your best, but also share and do that. We cannot be together for 5-7 years as executive team and not having some of the private challenges as well. When I'm then having a day or two when I'm back home in the time zone, I really still appreciate also seeing people I was with 25 or 30 years ago. So I still go cycling and I go sometimes golfing and
so you still have friends, quote unquote, from before you became...
And as I said, if there's one thing that has learned me over the years is if you want to do that, you want to be, or you have to be extremely structured. So I have a 3-year corporate calendar, and there are some yellow markings in there where there I know exactly where I am, and I know these dates are sort of blocked, and those are secret. Those are religious. And even if a prime minister says on Friday, the answer will be no, I won't go. And that's I think is because otherwise, coming back to the multiple stakeholders, then my diary is basically open for anyone to have an attack on, and then I can never have that. So I think we are good in blocking.
So a lot of predictability, and it's interesting because that predictability, it sounds, also creates flexibility in the rest of the time.
Yeah, and it creates a smile. I have friends that says, could you just tell us which Thursday, Friday, 2 years out, that we can have 2 days with you and we can go golfing or cycling and other stuff. And I like that because then it becomes not a limit, but it becomes a bit of a fun factor.
One more personal question. Let's assume you just hired me and I'm starting to work for you today. You invited me to a meeting during which you're going to establish the rules of engagement between us. How would you describe yourself as a leader, and what are the non-negotiables you would expect from me?
No, first of all, welcome. But I think also it's the presence. When you are a lot away and you are often out of sight, I think when you're there, you have to be present.
Okay.
And you and I, we will have that and we will share that present. So if I'm in a meeting, it's very rarely you see something that makes me either walk out of a meeting or drift away and sit and read. So it's the presence, be there, be authentic.
Okay.
Don't have to second guess. So I would much rather probably be accused from time to time that I can be fairly direct. But also at the same time, authentic is that you don't walk away with an unclear mind or in doubt. Was it something we like, or was it something we had a question to? So
what
really,
I see is what I get.
Yeah, absolutely. And then most people will say after 2 or 3 days visits in a region, it's nice to get your life back because program will be relatively full. I'm somehow blessed with don't need enormous hours of sleep, so I take most advantage and get the best out of the days where we spent together in what I will call outside markets to Denmark.
So what I'm hearing is a lot of physical presence. I want to be in meetings with people. I imagine somebody like you also has hours of emails and stuff to process. Do you do this yourself, or you have people who do this with you / for you?
I have a PA who I'm sure has the most wonderful job on earth, trying to coordinate my diary and also trying to keep some of it. But we have now found this, that where if it's still in there, it's probably because I expect her to answer it, and if it's in there, I often reply it myself. Okay. And that is a good way for me. It also means that if it's in there, and if people, colleagues, customers write directly, they will get a response, and they will get not a convoluted PA drafted response. So they get a response, and I think that's again coming back to the presence and the authenticism of having a leadership here, which works really well within Vestas. On the other hand, also trust-based. So when I sort of say non-negotiables are absolutely that the trust that goes on in having operations in 85 countries is we have to be able to trust each other.
Okay.
And that's non-negotiable, absolutely.
And when you say we have to be able to trust each other, what do I need to do for you to feel that you can trust me?
Be yourself. I mean, run it and be open about that. We know not everything will work to plan, and
own up to stuff.
Happy to share your success, but also happy to share your failure. As we say, we will. This with failure is not an option. We buried that 3 years ago, where we sort of played the really funeral music and said rest in peace.
Really?
Because we had an old saying in Vestas, which developed over a decade, that failure is not an option. And I think we both know from our time together that failure is always an option. So we would rather fail fast and then learn from it and then move on than we will pretend that failure is not happening, because it does. As we speak here, something goes wrong somewhere in the Vestas world. And that, I think, is the trust level of that, please don't give me those filters and other stuff. And then we try to avoid doing it the wrong way twice.
When you said we made an official burial, so you made an official burial of the sentence, failure is not an option.
Yeah, and it's failure. That's
henceforth we're not going to say that again.
Rest in peace. So that was RIP. So that was good, and I think that created also an enormous team focus and also fellowship. And I mean, come on, you sometimes you walk into it, and especially when we have long development and technology programs, we have to accept sometimes that it doesn't always come to the greatest success of all times.
And when it doesn't, learning from it is key.
Yes, absolutely. And learning from it as a team is key as well, because often I think we can also see back that there was a voice somewhere saying, well, are we sure of that? So this about being open and also inclusive in the dialogue of the exchange is quite important.
Last question, Henrik. You love your job because?
Because it's Vestas. And I love my job also because I get up and go to bed with the best purpose every day. We are a solution to saving a planet. And our solutions are rock solid in doing so. So for me, the purpose is just so crystal clear. And I think it's whether you are sort of onboarding new people to a factory, you are onboarding graduates. We've just seen a 10-fold increase in our applications on graduates in the last 24 months. And that's a good sign of that people start following also. Where is it actually finding the real purpose? So for me, that gets me out of bed, and it gets me going in both a heartbeat and a passion for the business.
And did it help you when you were losing money, and a lot of people were saying, "Come on, Henrik, how can you lose so much money?" Did this staying focused on the purpose did that help?
Yeah. But I will also be honest enough in saying there has been days and weeks where we struggled to see, hey, come on, this darkness. We almost felt we were blindfolded for a period of time in the middle of especially end of 21, first half of 22. It hasn't always been that easy. But it's a guidance of that we have to get through this, both together as a team, and of course it created a team spirit. But I would also say it had to have a balance over at fatigue, because we have constantly been doing sort of mitigations for 3 years.
Thank you very much for your time, and best wishes of continued success. Indeed, you are an important part of the solution, and obviously we wish you and your colleagues all the best of success. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.